So I'm going to so it's going to be interesting.
Okay. So you're still navigating your life? Yeah, okay.
I got to find my passion for it.
Hi, welcome. Hi, Allie. Hi. Welcome back, everybody. We're excited to have Professor Beaver here today. Before we get started, I have a few announcements. So a couple of events coming up that you might want to know about. The network is sponsoring a photo project to help students, staff, and faculty voice their words of support for sexual assault survivors. That will be taking place this Wednesday and Thursday, 8 to 10 p.m. in the Bassa Room in the Case Library. And also next Monday from 4:15 to 5:15 in Lathrop 107, you can take a picture to show your support for survivors. On Friday in the Center for Women's Studies, at 5 p.m. we have another rendition of our Dear Sister reading group. You can join Women's Studies faculty and staff for a discussion on survivorship and supporting survivors. People of all genders are welcome and no registration is required. There are readings on the back table over there by the lemonade. Next Tuesday, we also have a clothesline project happening in the center at 7 p.m. Where you can make t-shirts about your experience with violence or a message of support. That's at 7 p.m. Tuesday in here. Some other reminders is if you need to leave during the presentation, please do so quietly and respectfully so as not to disturb the presentation. If you could please clean up the food around you when you leave. In the back there is a compost for your food scraps and trash for the plates and everything else. If you can stay and help put away your chair at the end, we would really appreciate it. So again, thank you so much for being here. Welcome back after the break, and we're going to get things rolling with Professor Beaver's presentation. I'm going to turn it over to him.
Let me see. Do I need a microphone?
Yes.
Okay. I once got a teaching. Can you hear me? I once got a teaching evaluation that said you're too loud. I don't know what that's about. I'm going to start off by showing a clip from The Daily Show, where Jon Stewart is talking about a controversy with former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann's husband, Marcus Bachmann. So this happened about 5 years ago in 2011. I'm going to show this clip, and then I'm going to talk about it and start my presentation.
Representative Bachmann doesn't just talk the talk, though. She and her husband, Bachmann, walk the walk. Dr. Bachmann runs a Christian counseling firm that allegedly practices reparative therapy, or pray the gay away. And while he's denied that is a part of his practice, some of his former patients remember things differently. His path forward with my therapy would be to read the Bible and pray that to God that I would no longer be gay.
And if none of that worked, Rivera says the counselor had another idea. He suggested to you what?
Not acting out on my same-sex attractions and my life of celibacy. The doctor also prescribed a drug cocktail of ibuprofen, Novomitrin, and Heteron. Unfortunately, the side effect was a 4-hour erection, and I wasn't going to let that go to waste. Of course, in all of this, we haven't yet heard from the man himself, Dr. Bachmann, seen here dancing with his wife at a tea party. Wait a minute. Can we just come back here? That's Michelle Bachmann's husband. That's the guy teaching people not to be gay. Seriously. Is that the guy? Is he teaching people not to be gay, or is he like the Green Mile guy and just absorbing it all? No, you know what? No. I'm not going there. Don't go there, John. Just repress it. Just even though you're feeling a deep desire to comically exploit the fact that this man is an eyes-odd shirt away from being a gay character on Modern Family. Of course, Williams is a straight man pretending to be gay. No, don't do that, John. Just because Dr. Bachman's therapy to cure gayness does real damage to real people, and he is seemingly curing them so he can lord all the gayness for himself, there's no reason to let your primal urge to ridicule this seeming hypocrisy out. Just turn it off. Like a light switch, turn it off. The feeling will pass. The feeling... All right, you know what? Everyone looks gay when they're dancing anyway. Let's just hear what he has to say.
What do you say when a teenager says she's gay? There's that curiosity, but again, we like, you know, it is as if we have to understand barbarians need to be educated. They need to be disciplined.
Teenagers are barbarians who need to be educated. That's it. Discipline. Even though I think this man's views are terrible, and he dances and sounds not only gay, but center square gay,
Okay, now I have to compete with Jon Stewart. All right, so my presentation today is entitled Trapped in the Glass Closet, Feminine Straight Men and the Politics of Coming Out. And I'm going to talk more about this clip from The Daily Show, but I think this controversy is interesting for several reasons. One of the main reasons is that it demonstrates the continuing conflation of gender presentation with sexual identity. So, that's weird. There we go. Wrong button. So, Marcus, so as the clip points out, there were widespread speculation about Marcus Bachman's sexuality, especially after this controversy broke that his counseling practice engaged in reparative therapy or gay conversion therapy. When you start typing in Marcus Bachman on Google, the autocomplete type suggests Marcus Bachman gay as the second choice. Now, this idea that Marcus Bachman is a closeted gay man is shared widely in our popular culture. So one of the things I did for my project was look at comment sections in response to this controversy. So in a story that linked to this video on the Huffington Post, the most fave comments were, look at it this way, the first woman president can still have a first lady. Marcus should just give up the act and move to Palm Springs and live a fabulous life. As I've said before, after watching Marcus Bachman prance around in multiple videos and talk in various interviews, it's painfully obvious that man claims I am gay, hello, brighter than 1,000 suns simultaneously going supernova. My gaydar not only went off when listening to this guy, but it went into a 2-hour Judy Garland review hosted by RuPaul and directed by John Waters. My gaydar hit DEFCON Lavender after hearing that voice. So these are just a few of the top comments indicating that this sentiment that Jon Stewart's talking about is widely shared among the American public. I think this controversy is interesting because it highlights both shifts in continuities in public discourses about gender and sexuality and the relationship between the two. First of all, it indicates a shift. So the fact that this was even a controversy and the fact that the Bachmans themselves had to distanced themselves from the clinic. They denied claims that they engaged in reparative therapy. And this was mainstream news, by the way, indicates decreasing public acceptance of overt homophobia. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Yet this controversy also highlights the continuing dominance of what some scholars have called the gender inversion model of homosexuality. So this is the belief that gay and lesbian people usually exhibit traits associated with the opposite gender, right? So hence the stereotype of the effeminate gay man or the mannish lesbian. So again, the gay and lesbian people usually exhibit traits, gender traits associated with the quote-unquote opposite sex. Now, in this discourse, promulgated by Jon Stewart and others in the media, Bachman is rendered doubly deviant. First of all, because he fails to conform to heteromasculine norms, right? So he dances, he talks with a lisp, he's effeminate. Yet he's also deviant because he's assumed to be a closeted gay man. So as I'll talk about later, there's an imperative in our culture now that gay and lesbian people come out of the closet, that they're out and proud, right? This has been a tactic pressed or used by the gay and lesbian rights movement. Now, I think what's interesting about this in particular is the way that this instance highlights the limits of liberal tolerance, right? So it's hard to imagine liberal commentators like Jon Stewart, Lawrence O'Donnell also engages in this, openly mocking an openly gay man for being effeminate. So in this way, Marcus Bachman represents an easy target for public expressions of femophobia. So in other words, Jon Stewart can mock effeminacy very openly, only because Marcus Bachman is assumed to be a closeted and therefore self-loathing gay man. Now, this is something that's not lost on some commentators, right? So some people in the gay press were critical of this kind of sissy-phobia, right? Or look at him, he's so fruity, kind of mocking that Stewart engages in. So before I get into my findings, I want to contextualize the social context in which I'm doing my research, right? So scholars have pointed out since the early 1990s, there have been dramatic shifts in the social and legal status of gays and lesbians in the United States. Now they point to several pieces of evidence of this. For one, they point to opinion polls. Right, so when we look at shifts in attitudes about gay marriage, we've seen very rapid transformations in public opinion. Transformations that we don't tend to find in opinion polls on other issues, right? So this is from a Gallup poll that says, do you think marriages between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by the law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriages? Now we can see in 1996, 68% said should not be valid, 27% said should be valid. Now, in less than a 20-year period, right, we see this shift. Now 55% in 2014 said should be valid, 42% said should not be valid. Now, these are averages, right? If we break it down by age groups, we see even higher percentages of people ages 18 to 35 saying gay and lesbian marriages should be recognized as valid, right? So this is just an average, but this actually represents a dramatic shift. Now, likewise, when we see polls about acceptance of homophobia, we see an increasing number of people say they don't approve of explicit versions of homophobia. Now, we also know people say they're not racist, right? So this, in and of itself, doesn't indicate anything other than people aren't willing to admit that they're homophobic, right? Now, I've also seen dramatic shifts in the legal status of gays and lesbians, although slower than most of us would hope. So, for instance, we recently saw the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The Supreme Court ruling this summer in Obergefell versus Hodges struck down state-level bans on same-sex marriage. President Obama had an executive order that extended benefits to partners of gay and lesbian people employed by the federal government. We've also seen increasing numbers of state and local governments prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation in employment, housing, and provision of services. Now, as with any shifts, right, this change is uneven, right? So it's certainly too early to say, okay, we've achieved victory, right? Because there's still no anti-discrimination law at the federal level. So activists for years have been trying to pass INDA unsuccessfully. There are no state-level laws in 28 states. And even when ordinances prohibiting discrimination are passed, they can be overturned, as they recently were in Houston. So voters overturned a city ordinance that banned discrimination, largely because of fears of transgender women using the wrong bathroom, quote-unquote wrong bathroom. So again, we can see changes, right, but we should exercise caution in not overstate how much things have changed. We've also seen increasing gay and lesbian visibility in popular culture. So I just give just a few of the examples. So scholars who study media and media representations argue that in contrast to previous eras when gay and lesbian people were shown, they were shown as sick, deviant, suicidal, or used as the butt of jokes, right? So increasingly we see gay and lesbian people represented as normal, although also very, very white and middle class, right? So as with anything, we should be critical of these representations, yet we can recognize that there are increasing representations. So I did interviews in my project with mostly men who were ages 23 to 32. Most of them were in their late 20s, early 30s. And many of these men that I interviewed who are from small towns said, I'd never seen a gay person until I saw Will and Grace on TV. So again, when they were in high school or middle school, this is the first time they knew that gay people existed. So several people told me that. I think that young people today are growing up in a very different environment. So that's some of the context that provides a background for my research question. So I'm interested in what does it mean to be heterosexual in a world of increasing gay and lesbian visibility. Now we know that in our culture, sexuality is understood according to the hetero-homo binary, right? So people are either believed to be straight or gay. Of course, there are bisexual people and lots of people on the continuum, but it's, as we know from studies of bisexual people, they often face questions about their existence, right? So one of my favorite headlines in the New York Times was, scientists prove bisexuality exists, right? And then all of a sudden, Dan Savage, who for years had said, no, there's no such thing as bisexuality, said, okay, well, scientists have proven it by hooking stuff up to people's genitals and seeing that they're aroused by both gay and straight porn, which to me just proves that some people are aroused by having stuff hooked up to their genitals in a laboratory. So we know, and people who study sexuality have argued for a long time, that the meanings of what it means to be gay and what it means to be straight are intricately linked, right? So scholars like Jonathan Nantax have convincingly argued that the heterosexual didn't exist until the homosexual was invented, right? So what it means to be straight was always tied to what it meant to be gay. So the consolidation of a straight or heterosexual identity depended on the repudiation of being gay or lesbian. Now, as we know, there are ambiguities around people's sexuality. So one of my questions is how do ambiguous straight men, so that is men who aren't obviously read as straight, and I'll talk about what that means later, manage their sexual identity and interaction? Now, I'm interested in identity, right? And that, as sociologists who study sexuality argue that there are differences between practices, identities, desires, right? So the men I'm studying identify as straight. That doesn't mean they are straight, right? They might be engaging in all kinds of gay sex, right, and still say, I'm a straight man, right? So I'm interested in identity and how that's produced in interaction. And I'm also interested in questions of power and privilege, right? Because these aren't equal identities. So to claim a straight identity is not the same as claiming a gay identity, right? Because you're claiming entrance into a category that's privileged in lots of ways. So I'm wondering how heterosexual privilege works or fails to work for men with an ambiguous sexual identity. Now, I'm a sociologist who's interested in ethnographic qualitative methods, right? So what I did was conducted life history interviews with 25 straight identified men who claimed to be mistaken as gay. So I posted this flyer that said, are you ever mistaken for being gay? Are you over the age of 18? Just so I don't get arrested. Would you like to share your experience? Actually, it's IRB requires me to do that, right? Okay. Although Doug, my friends were saying, this sounds like a fetish here. So the ages of my respondents range from 23 to 50. The average age was 32, so I had a couple men in my study who one was 50, one was 47. So they raised that a little bit. Most of the men were in their late 20s, early 30s. 22 identified as white, 3 identified as Hispanic. The median income was $30,000. Most of these men were from middle class or lower middle class backgrounds, although they're now working class jobs in Austin, working as baristas, many of them working in the service industry. Now, half the respondents were recruited from my network, so I use what sociologists call snowball sampling. So we have respondents refer other people to us. So I would say half the people were people I knew in some capacities from the art and music scene in Austin. The other half were men who had responded to my flyer. I conducted this research in Austin, Texas, which is of course significant for my research. Many of the men I interviewed were I found an interesting pattern that many of them were from small towns in the Midwest and had moved to Austin. Austin's one of the fastest growing cities in the country, so it was an interesting place to do this research. And because I'm doing life history interviews, I'm asking these men about their experience over their lifetime. So what was it like growing up? What was it like growing up in their small towns? How did moving to Austin change how they're read? So that was something that came up a lot in a lot of my studies. Before I get into my findings, I want to talk briefly about what I'm interested in. I study masculinities. As a sociologist, I'm interested in how masculinity is socially constructed, right? So I don't consider masculinity to be something that exists on the Y chromosomes. I don't think it's in our genes. I don't think it's inherent or timeless. Masculinity is constructed, and I'm interested especially in how it's constructed in interactions. Now, sociologists who study masculinity have repeatedly pointed out that central to masculinity is the repudiation of femininity. So masculinity, like other identity categories, relies on the repudiation of an abstract other, right? So it's defined against others. In this case, now, again, there are all kinds of masculinities. It's racialized, it's classed, right, as well. But the repudiation of femininity means that masculinity has historically been defined by what it's not. So being masculine means being not feminine. Now, what femininity means is historically and culturally specific, right? So, but at the heart of proving that you're masculine, constructing your masculinity, is avoiding, demonstrating that you're not feminine, policing feminine behaviors in others, policing them in yourself. Now, tied to this is the centrality of homophobia. So Michael Kimmel, really well-known masculinity scholar, argues that homophobia is a central part of masculinity. So both having homophobic attitudes has been a part of demonstrating that you're sufficiently masculine. Homophobia has also been used to police gender in others. So C.J. Pascoe is a sociologist who studied in high school. She talked about the use of what she calls the fag epithet, right? So that boys constantly call other boys fags as a way to police behaviors that step outside the bounds of what's considered masculine in that school. Now, some scholars have argued, so masculinity scholars are trying to understand, myself included, how masculinity changes in a world of increasing gay and lesbian visibility, in a world where there appears to be decreasing acceptance of explicit homophobia. Now, some scholars have argued that there's a declining significance of homophobia in the construction of heterosexual masculinities. I happen to not agree with these scholars entirely, but their argument is that as gay and lesbian people become more visible, as it's less acceptable to be homophobic, that young boys and men are increasingly saying they have gay friends, right? Going to gay bars, going to gay pride, associating themselves with symbols that would have marked them as being gay in the past, right? So these scholars are saying that straight men are now engaging in practices that have been coded as feminine and or gay without that challenging their status as a straight man. Now, first thing that probably comes to mind is the metrosexual. This is the most widely known and culturally recognized category of this. So that's a little blurry. Anyone know who this is? David Beckham, right? So David Beckham's kind of the quintessential metrosexual. The metrosexual as a term was coined by British cultural critic Mark Simpson in the mid-1990s. And there's an interesting kind of history to the term, because now when Simpson originally coined the term metrosexual, he was talking about young, urban, mainly white, upper middle class men who are engaging in particular kinds of consumption and grooming practices, right? Going to salons, getting wax, buying all kinds of face creams, wearing stylish clothes, right? So engaging in practices that have been coded as feminine. Now, Simpson argues that these practices were pioneered by urban gay men, but when Simpson coined the term metrosexual, he didn't specify the sexuality of the men who are engaging in this, right? He says gay men engage in it, straight men, bisexual men. He was interested in the way that this sort of queered masculinity, right? In that here you have men putting all kinds of attention into their appearance and inviting a gaze, right? Inviting being looked at, whereas men have been conventionally considered to be the ones that are doing the looking. So Simpson's interested in these changes in consumption practices. Now, marketers get a hold of the term and say, hey, now we can start selling beauty products to men, right? We have this label that we can reassure them that you're not gay if you engage in these practices, right? So marketers kind of latch onto the term, and then it becomes associated with straight men, as opposed to being not specified in terms of the sexuality. Now, of course, there's still some skepticism and some sense that these men are actually being defensive, right? So claiming to be metrosexual is a kind of defense, right? Kind of panic about being labeled as gay. I should point out that this is mainly an attributed label, and it's mainly pejorative. So I'm not convinced that most men identify as metrosexual, just like most people don't identify as hipster, right? It's a label that's attributed to them. Now, not everybody's happy about these shifts, right? So masculinity scholars, some say, well, these are promising, they're progressive changes, right? We're seeing a kind of softening of the kinds of policing around men and men's behaviors, right? But other scholars have pointed out that this kind of disgust, that the fact that the metrosexual is a pejorative term also points to a kind of crisis in masculinity. Of course, masculinity scholars have pointed out that masculinity is always in crisis. It's always been in crisis. And if any of you have seen the hashtag masculinity so fragile, right? There's a kind of constant performance that requires, it's something that has to always be demonstrated and always be proved. And so for that reason, it's always been in crisis. This is a meme that popped up on my Facebook from someone who I very quickly unfriended or defriended. I removed them from my Facebook live, even though they provided me with valuable information and images to show and talk about in class, right? So again, there is, as with any changes, a backlash, right? I mean, it's my assessment of the popularity of the show Mad Men as a kind of pining for a time when men were men. Okay, so so now it's interesting I'm talking about masculinity. What I think is interesting is that these scholars talk about these as transformations in masculinities. But my argument is, why call it masculinities? In fact, why can't we talk about male femininity? So if any of you know, Jack Halberstam wrote a popular book called Female Masculinity, right, where she talks about this need to kind of break this link between masculinity and the male body, right? So that her argument was that women can also be masculine, right? And so I'm interested in thinking about and talking about male femininity. Now, what I define as male femininity is men's engagement in practices and or embodiment of characteristics that are culturally ascribed to women and are therefore coded as feminine. Now, as you'll notice, I'm careful here. I don't believe they're essential traits, right? These are culturally constructed traits. So there may be disagreement about what they are, but there's also, I think, some widespread agreement about traits that are considered to be feminine. Now, probably unsurprisingly to me, many of the men in my study describe themselves as feminine and or effeminate. So remember, these are men who are read as gay, or claim to be read as gay, right? So my interviews are asking them, you know, like, how would you describe your gender? How would you describe your sexuality? When are you misread as gay? How do you know you're misread as gay? Who does the misreading, right? And maybe misreading's the wrong term, because we could also say they're perceived. Maybe there's not an actual misreading, but to these men there is, right? Because they identify as straight and they claim to be mistaken as being gay. So many of them describe themselves as feminine and or effeminate. Now, what does this mean? So the men in my study describe themselves as feminine based on their aesthetics, so their clothing styles, their grooming practices, you know, wearing tight clothes, wearing stylish clothes, going to salons, getting their nails done, right? Particular kinds of grooming practices and styles. Emotional traits, right? So they'd say, I'm sensitive, right? I'm empathetic. I express my emotions. Of course, these are stereotypes, right? These are stereotype traits. They also talk about their comportment, right? So they would say, I talk with my hands. Something I know nothing about. Or ways of standing, ways of carrying themselves, ways of sitting, right? I remember when I was a kid being afraid to sit with my legs crossed, right? And I remember this kind of relentless policing around that, right? So ways of sitting, ways of walking, and their tastes. And of course, these are stereotypical tastes, right? So they'd say, well, I like musicals, like I like theater. I like shopping, things that are stereotyped as feminine. So for example, Sean described himself as a feminine person, and when I asked why, he said, for a lot of reasons. Okay, my voice, the way that I speak, the way that I approach people in a very different way. So other ways, the way that I dress, I would say I dress feminine. The way that I take care of my hair or any other grooming stuff, I would say would be more feminine. And the way, my hand gestures, just a lot of things that I realize are very subconscious and that I do are just read as more feminine than masculine. I don't have swagger, you know. So I should say that Sean engaged in what people call up talk, right? So you all know up talk, where it sounds like everything you're saying is a question, and it's a stereotypical feminine trait, right? This is something that Sean engaged in throughout our interview. Now, these men, at least in what they're telling me, right? Of course, they're telling me a particular story, right? They claim to embrace their femininity. So they actually claim a special sort of social esteem, right? They're not interested in repudiating it, at least at this point. Although some of them told stories of moments in their lives where they did feel the need to police and change their behavior. And some of them also talked about instances now where they find themselves kind of butching it up, sometimes because they're afraid of physical violence. So they claim a special moral value in their femininity. So Jared, for example, says, now I should say Jared identifies with goth subculture, so he wears, you don't know what goths look like, he wears like black clothes, velvet sports jackets, and makeup, and has black hair. He said, he proclaimed, I'm effeminate. I recognize that. I embrace that. I wish more men were, in order to counteract the principles that I feel like keep men down and keep them from showing their emotions. Now, feminist scholars would say, in fact, these aren't the things that keep men down, right? These are the things that give men power, right? Is repudiation of the feminine. But of course, scholars also point out the harmful effects of repressing your emotions, the way that masculinity is very hard on the body, the way that men damage their health because they don't go see doctors, for example. Now, what Jared and other men in my study did was try to distance themselves from the typical man, right? So a lot of their discourse was, I'm not like other guys. I'm not like typical guys, right? Now, in many ways, this sort of typical man, as a result of some of the mainstreaming of feminist critiques, has been stigmatized and parodied, right? So it's this kind of parody of the kind of retrograde, macho man who's overcompensating, who objectifies women, who can't express his emotions, who's unstylish, right? So these men get to portray themselves as being more progressive, more enlightened, right? And so that's one of the ways that they use this femininity to kind of bolster themselves, right? To make themselves feel special. Now, as I've said, gender and sexuality are conflated, right? So we see in the Marcus Bachmann clip that his sexual orientation is called into question because he dances, because he talks with the lisp, because he moves in particular ways. So these men have to deal with this conflation, right? And it puts them in a bind because they're also expected to be out of the closet. So as scholars have pointed out, the closet's been a dominant metaphor for understanding gay and lesbian life in the United States. Now, the closet's created by the state, by the family, by institutions like the medical profession, right, who actually, you know, I show this documentary before Stonewall to my students where they talk about the history of gay and lesbian communities, and this woman's talking about how she was institutionalized when her mother found out she was gay. And they say, oh, did you know, to my students, did you know that happened? Did you know that could happen? And they said, no. Right now, so there were all kinds of forces that actually constructed the closet, that required gay and lesbian people to pass as straight, to marry, to pretend or at least feign interest in the other sex, right? And often if they were interested in expressing their desires, to do so secretly, right? To live what Stephen Seidman's called a double life. Now, part of the gay liberation movement's response to that was urging gay and lesbian people to come out wherever you are, right? Out of the closets into the street. So this was a tactic that was used that was seen as important for both the individual psychologically, to be true, to be authentic to yourself, right? To not repress and hide this thing or feel shame. And also important collectively for the movement, right? So the argument is, part of the way that heterosexuality remains dominant is gay and lesbian people are supposed to be invisible, right? So that's one of the ways that heterosexual dominance was created. So gay and lesbian activists argued that people should be out, right? So that people can see gay and lesbian people, they can see, oh, these are my friends, my neighbors, my senator, right? All kinds of public officials and at the private level. So, real quick, there is a kind of, how do I go back? Okay. There is an imperative to come out, right? So part of this argument about coming out constructs what some scholars have said, the good gay and the bad gay, right? The good gay is out, they're proud, they're gender normative, they're in monogamous relationships, they're productive citizens, good consumers. The bad gay are those that are still in the closet, that are self-loathing, those that don't follow gender norms, right? Now, within this imperative to come out, we know that there's still pressure for people to be in the closet, right? So some scholars have said we live in a post-gay world. I'm not convinced of that. If we now that argument is that gay identity isn't as central to people's identity. It's not the central part. That we're past this moment where it's a big deal to come out. In fact, what we find is there is still pressure. So there are people that are in what some scholars have called, like Eve Sedgwick's called the glass closet. So in the glass closet section, it's kind of the open secret about sexuality, right? So people identify as straight, but everybody kind of knows they're not, right? So when Anderson Cooper did finally come out, the response was kind of yawn. Of course, we knew it, right? Same with Ricky Martin, same with Jodie Foster, right? So these are people that for years there had been speculation about their sexuality, right? And then when they come out, it's either indifference or what took you so long, right? Now, Marcus Bachman's also placed there. So the men in my study they are in a bind, right? They identify as feminine, they engage in feminine behaviors, those are read and coded as gay, seen as signs that they're gay, but they identify as straight. Now, we also know that if you're protesting too much, it's probably a sign of something, right? So you'll see pretty regularly, again, scientists prove that homophobes are really gay, right? So there's this idea that being homophobic is a sign that you're gay, right? So the men that I interview have to do this kind of delicate dance of where they're like, I'm not gay, I'm straight, but they can't appear too panicked about that. Although one of the first people I interviewed was a friend of mine who was kind of a pilot interview for the study, posted on his Facebook, "For the last time, world, I'm not gay." Now, he was one of the few ones that had this kind of very explicit proclamation, which probably raises some eyebrows about why he's so upset and so concerned. I received this email from a 47-year-old man named Parker in response to my flyer. He said, "I spent a year of college in East Arkansas, not my choice. Somebody wrote fag on my door. I don't care about football or most any team sport. I like to cook and tend to dress well. I don't mind dressing up for fancy dinners out. But I'm attracted to women, not men. My wife was amused when a guy recently asked me, 'Are you gay?' Not realizing I was with my wife and mother of our 3 kids. Oh yeah, that happens to me. It doesn't bother me. I just quit caring so much of what other people think. If somebody doesn't like me, I figure they have something wrong with them. I'm not trying to fit in. Yes, I have like 60 pairs of shoes, but that doesn't make me gay, just well-heeled." He in fact invited me over to look at his shoe collection. I declined. I think what's interesting about this is the way that this man, he's recognizing this gender inversion model, right? So he's saying, yes, I engage in all of these things, right? And he recognizes that those are the things that lead him to be read as gay, right? So most of the men talked about this connection between being read as gay and being perceived as effeminate. But what they do in response is try and disarticulate, right? Disconnect gender from sexuality, right? So they have to reject notions that engaging in particular cultural practices signify same-sex desire, and they seek to claim an identity as feminine, straight men. Now, part of the way they do this is, I'm sure not surprising, a kind of relentless, as you see in this, referencing of female partners. Kind of, as you can see here, he's saying not only his wife, but also the mother of his 3 children, right? So he firmly establishes himself as straight, but also in a normative nuclear family. Now, one way that men try to disarticulate these two is by claiming the label metrosexual, although this wasn't that common. But one man did say, now I'm asking him about his gender and sexuality, and it's interesting because he says right away, I feel that I'm pretty comfortable with my sexuality. I feel that I do exhibit more feminine, like typically feminine traits than like the average male. I think a lot of men, especially in the South, are more concerned with kind of keeping this kind of strong image of the strong male. And yeah, I've always been, like, my frame has always been a little more slender, and I've always, you know, been kind of comfortable. Like, I used to, you know, at one point I was called the Metro or whatever. And I was like that was how other people made sense of you as a metrosexual. Yeah, and I embraced that. I was happy with that. You know, that didn't bother me. And really, like, over time, I mean, I would say that, like, from college on and maybe even high school, it didn't bother me that people would assume I was gay. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it in a way. So this was not uncommon for men to say, actually, I like it. I like being read as gay, right? And again, I think this goes back to this way that it makes them feel more progressive, more enlightened. Now, another thing that, as you'll see, as you saw in that last response, there's a lot of kind of proving that you're comfortable, right? Because that's part of this production of a straight identity, that you're not bothered with being read as gay, right? Because if you're bothered and if you're too anxious, then that might be saying something about yourself. So if any of you get this reference, right, on Seinfeld, there was a Seinfeld episode where George and Jerry were misread or mistaken as being gay lovers, and throughout the whole episode they kept saying, like, we're not gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that, right? So kind of is making fun of this particular panic about being read as gay while also highlighting their anxieties. So again, this is Sean, who I already referenced. He said, I didn't want to tell people I was straight because the mentality that I was taught when I was a kid, and is still reinforced all the time, is that if you're defensive about your sexuality, then you're gay, right? Which is screwed up. It's just, I mean, there's research that shows that more homophobic people might be gay, but to defend your sexuality or just describe your sexuality, but in any case, even just saying you have a sexuality means you're gay, right? So Sean did a lot of writing and talking about, so he's a comedian, he writes a lot about gender and sexuality, and he said in a lot of ways, writing and publicly speaking about being a feminine straight man can be taken as, well, why are you so defensive? Or what's wrong with being gay? He's like nothing is wrong with being gay. I'm just not that. Okay, I'm going a little long, so I'm going to move through quick. Now, part of what happens for these men is that they are what I call put in the closet, right? So the title of my talk is kind of trapped in the glass closet, that because these two things are conflated, these things are seen as signs, right? They're signs that these men are in fact gay. And some of the men even talked about women they were dating who were questioning their sexuality, right? So Jared says, a woman he was dating said, she said, you've got to at least be bi. Tell me, you've got to at least be bi. I can't understand you being the way that you are and not being at least bi. It's like, I think it's a matter of time before you come out of the closet. And then later he's talking about, so I said most of the men actually they liked being read as gay, except when gay men were being too pushy or too forward, right? So several of them talked about being aggressively hit on in bars. So Jared says, well, if they're touching me, he means gay men at bars, they're touching me, I push them away. If they ask me for my number, I tell them, well, if I can tell they're gay, I tell them flat out, I'm not gay, just so you know. A lot of the time they think, oh, whatever, you haven't come out of the closet yet. Like, you're just queerbait. Or like, you're just out there to fuck with my head. How dare you? And they take it personal, like being rejected. Many of these men don't believe me because they think that, well, maybe you just haven't owned up to it yet. You just haven't come out of the closet, and it's like a matter of time. It's just a matter of time, so let me be that guy to push you in that direction. Like, I want to be that guy, you know. I want to show you what you really want, kind of thing. So several other men also kind of referenced this. Now, I should point out that these men, and I can talk about this in the question and answer, these men did utilize and draw upon heterosexual privilege or straight privilege or signal their identity to kind of mitigate the effects of homophobia, to protect themselves against being the victim. Yet many of them did experience homophobia. So most respondents reported experienced homophobia ranging from the explicit and overt to more subtle forms of homophobic microaggressions. So Julian, 33-year-old white man, said, I have this very specific memory, which is key. of my mother when I was probably pretty young. I must have been 6, 7, 8 years old, somewhere in that range. Like, of my mother accosting me in the car and telling me, you better not turn out to be gay. And I don't really understand what that meant at the time, you know, but I did understand it to mean something bad, you know. And when I figured it out, of course I became worried about it. I think that's always played a guilt thing for me. It's always been there, it's been in that part of my head. And, you know, I had a Catholic upbringing, so there's all that guilt, you know. Now I asked him what sparked this, right? And he said that his parents owned a restaurant business, and when he was a kid, he used to play around with the napkins. And he'd make these little pillows out of the napkins. You know, he'd like take 2 napkins and stuff them with other napkins and staple together and like draw hearts on it and stuff. And he said that his mother and aunt found him doing that, and they ripped the napkins up. And they said, boys don't do that, right? Now, his mother was raising him, he was being raised by his mother and aunt, and he speculates there were a lot of anxieties about him not having a father around. I should say that questions about parents raised the most kind of emotional responses in all of my study, and there were lots of stories about parents kind of having these conversations about like, we hope you're not gay, or you better not be gay, or we'd be sad if you're not gay. So again, we live in a culture that relentlessly forecloses these kinds of options and possibilities for people. So this is the last story I'll tell about this. So I asked Sean, he said, do you think that your gender presentations changed over time? And in a matter-of-fact way, he said, yeah, absolutely. So when I was a kid, when I was little, before I kind of understood the repercussions of gender and gender expression, I used to love wearing my sister's clothes. I have 2 older sisters, and I just looked up to them. They were like the coolest people in my life, right? So I would wear, like, I love to wear their shirts. I tried to get them to paint my nails, or I'd get them to braid my hair, or whatever, and it was super fun. And they wouldn't do it because they knew that it was wrong. But sometimes my mom would make them do it because I was like 6, you know? So this is interesting because Jason the last character just told a story about his mother kind of repressing these things, but in this instance, Sean's mother encourages it. So he said, oh, your mom actually made them? And he said, my mom didn't care. I think that in a lot of ways, like, if it wasn't for my mom's affirmation of just kind of like individuality in these ways, I don't think I would have ever become comfortable, and he sounds unsure of how to say this, with the way that I am. After several, getting beaten up by several people in my school, like, over and over and over again, I just started to realize, like, it was as sad as this is, I literally got, like, my femininity beaten out of me. It was like, every time it happened, I was like, okay, I need to change one thing. And then eventually I was just like, you know, change one thing. And then eventually I was just like, you're a kind of like posturing hyper-masculine boy. And there was this time he laughed. When I looked back at these pictures, and I was so ashamed of, like, I was like, what was I wearing in these pictures? And I was wearing like a white ripped up tank top and, like, he said with disgust, baggy jeans. And I looked back and he just cracked up, like, that was me. I was like, that was never me. Like, that was never me, but that's what I wore. So I'm going to skip ahead to my conclusion. Now, so I'm interested in the effects of the glass closet, right? Or the belief that some straight identified men are obviously and indisputably gay. I don't want to deny the fact that people are in the closet. Of course they are. Because we still live in a world where there are sanctions against people who come out as gay. But this is problematic because it conflates gender presentation and sexual orientation. And in that way, it erases the possibility of being a feminine straight man. Because again, these men constantly, they can't be seen as straight, and it upholds this idea that straightness and heterosexuality is about conforming to particular kinds of norms that are harmful for men and harmful for women who they're in relationship with. And I think what's important is these men's experience highlight the persistent conflation of gender presentation with sexual identity, despite claims that these things are changing. And I think it's a conflation that underwrites systems of violence against all forms of femininity. So I think it's really important that we start talking about and thinking about the issue of femophobia, which is the fear and hatred and disgust of femininity and things coded as femininity. And I want to show this quick cartoon. This is, if any of you know Tony Millionaire's cartoon, Mockies. It's ran in a lot of weekly papers, so it's in the Austin Chronicle. And this was the bottom. So he has like the main comic, and then he has a small comic that's separate on the bottom. And it says Stodge Riverton is the name. So there's a younger man and an old man, and the old man says, "Good God, man, must you flit about so? You're prancing and mincing like a woman." The younger man says, "You old homophobe." The old man's confused, and then in the end he says, "You idiot, I'm no homophobe, I'm a misogynist." And it's funny, but it's sad and true, right? And it points out something feminists have argued for a long time, that the repression of the femininity in men that's a part of homophobia also is about a contempt for women. I just want to end with a couple quotes that I really like. This one's from Kath Weston. She says, "Gender is about race, is about class, is about sexuality, is about age, is about nationality, is about an entire range of social relations. In a society where these terms matter, people cannot check identities at the door. In a society where standing on the wrong side of one of these terms can get your head bashed in, people ignore identities at their peril." And then this is one of my favorite quotes from Judith Butler. She says, "Some people have asked me, what's the use of increasing possibilities for gender? I tend to answer, possibility is not a luxury, it is crucial threat." Thanks. Questions? Hi, Christian.
Following up on the last point that you made
It's called what?
homophobia, a weapon of sexism.
Only the title. I haven't read it.
Yeah, and that it really does. It makes that argument right back to that. It's in service to sexism.
I will definitely want to check that out. Thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you for the talk. This was really stimulating. Did any of your informants identify as queer politically? And what did they think of cisgender? Did they identify as cisgender male? I'm assuming not.
Only one, only Sean, and that's because he's the one that I think had the most kind of knowledge. Like, he writes about the social construction of gender and sexuality, so he, when kind of identifying himself, went through the most like detailed, nuanced kind of list. And Sean and another man did kind of, I'm like, how do you identify? And it was interesting because so those two and maybe one other said, like, I've thought about identifying as queer. They brought it up, and partially because their gender expression and all of the reasons people might want to identify as queer is, like, I want to leave open this possibility. But they were really sensitive to the idea that they would be appropriating this term, so they were cautious in claiming queer because they were like, we're still straight men. We're still like in relationships with women, and we don't want to appropriate a label that they had concerns about being seen in that way. So, and then in terms of like, well, I mean, I'm recruiting based on, are you straight identified? So it's unsurprising that I didn't get people who identified as bisexual, although one person did identify as bi-curious. And they said, well, I actually haven't been with a man yet, but I'm curious. Another said, well, I've had this. This was really funny. He said, I'm curious and I'm sad that I never did anything with a man, but now that I'm in my 30s, that time has passed. Like, he was like, I needed to do that in my early 20s. So it kind of points out this kind of linear notion of how our sexualities are supposed to progress. So, yeah.
You talked about the crisis of masculinity and how you have to prove or like men are constantly having to prove that they're masculine. I was curious about what you think of the same but for female, and if it's different, why so?
If it's different for women, if women have to constantly prove their femininity, I think that we're all subject to these gender norms. I've written some about women in sports, and I know there's like tremendous pressure on women in sports to kind of overcompensate or prove that they're still feminine, even though they're engaging in masculine activities. At the same time, a lot of gender scholars have pointed out that things are kind of opening up for girls. So if you read stuff, Emily Kane has written a book on parenting and gender, and she finds that a lot of parents encourage their daughters to engage in quote-unquote masculine pursuits like sports, science, but they don't encourage their son to engage in practices like caretaking and doing housework and domestic work and empathy. So, and if we look, there's that really amazing but also, it's a commercial and it's a commodification, but that gap ad where, all these young girls are wearing like t-shirts and jeans and skateboarding and playing drums, right? And there's this kind of celebration of this widening of options for girls, but it's like, where's the equivalent? Where are boys wearing dresses? Where are boys playing with dolls? Now, do y'all see the Barbie commercial? Mm-hmm. So there is a new Barbie commercial where it has a little boy and he's like, this Barbie's fabulous, right? So maybe it's opening up, but I think we're all subject to those pressures, but in different ways. Yeah.
So, sure.
So, I guess I'm trying to figure out, you talked about gender presentation versus sexuality, and I'm trying to figure out where gendered labor fits in. In particular, I'm thinking about kids, so like you had at least one respondent who has kids. But when I think about what gender means, it means clearly how you look like, and it might also mean something to your sexuality, but also the kind of work that you do, the kind of care that you do, the kind of labor that you do. How does that fit into this model?
Well, I will say the guy that had he told me about his 60 pairs of shoes. He was a stay-at-home dad whose wife was like a high-powered lawyer, and he sort of talked about like taking care of the kids and how much he liked cooking, but then he'd say, like chefs, the top-paid chefs are men, right? So he had to, he's doing this feminized activities because it's not for pay at home, where he has to say, but look at the best chefs in the world are men, right? So, it's an interesting question. It's like a lot of the men in my study, like several of them were single, several of them, so they weren't in relationships, which was also an interesting part of their story about like why they're misread or why they're not in relationships is because women think they're gay. But I do remember in terms of like, thinking about a kind of labor in the family or like within the home, like, some of the men that did have kids would say like, well, I'm a dad and that changed all of this for me. Like in terms of then being recognized as straight, many of the men were in the service industry. So a lot of them are doing some kind of like emotional labor, like as part of their jobs as baristas or whatever. So I don't know how much that played into it for them. Yeah.
I'll be loud. You referenced the role of the media in sort of the larger social context, and myself personally, I've had this moment where a friend of mine didn't have this glorious coming out. She just started dating a woman, and I was so confused for a while. And then I was like, oh, I expected it to be like Glee. Like and not like Glee. And so I was wondering if any of the people in your study sort of reference those larger narratives that are emerging now that we have more shows like that?
The most that they referenced was sort of seeing Will and Grace. Like Will and Grace came up several times, and it's like, and I'm like skeptical in some ways about the power of these shows, but then it's like it made sense. Like many of these people were from like small towns. This is like pre-internet, and it was like the first time they would say, oh, like that's like what a gay person is, right? You know, it's interesting you talk about being confused about this not hearing this kind of coming out narrative. Susanna Donato Walters wrote this fabulous book called The Tolerance Trap, and she talks about these shifts in representations of gay and lesbian people, and that in the past, the coming out story was like the narrative, like it defined the whole character arc and development of the character. And she's like, you know, one thing that's interesting now is shows are kind of skipping that. So we see characters who are just out, they haven't come out, that's not a part of the story. And she's critical of that because she says it implies a kind of false notion of progress, right? That it's like, okay, well now everybody's just out and it's fine and they're not facing these kinds of homophobic reactions. So the people in my study mainly referenced Will and Grace. And I think that's, you know, probably the age that they are. You know, I don't know if they watched Glee, but yeah.
I'm not sure how to ask this question, but ever since you showed the slides where the man said that he would push gay men away in a bar, I've been thinking about how gender presentation can be a signal of sexuality in maybe an older time, right? A context in which being able to signify your sexuality that way was necessary, and also a way to safeguard yourself in a certain way. I'm just curious if you have any.
You're talking about the kinds of like signals that would have to go on about amongst like gay men, or?
Yeah, like I mean, to a certain extent, there's kind of like there's a mismatch of meaning going on, right? Because it seems like so he's being read as gay by a gay man. Of course, there's this larger sort of wanting to be like the one who holds your hand out of the closet, or what, right? There's that kind of, but it seems in a way like there's this kind of it's kind of like a move to for a countercultural move, right, to gender present in a certain way, is now sort of a problem, right? I mean, now this, in that.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that, if you think about gaydar, like, you know, gaydar developed in a context where it's like people had to be able to read clues. Like, if you wanted a partner, right, you had to look for ways to like read and assess whether that's safe, right? So, men like in the 20s would wear like red handkerchiefs, right? They were all like in their pockets, so it's a sign, right? So yeah, it's complicated in that, and these men, I should say these men are like, they're not surprised, right? They're like, I understand why men are approaching me. Like, I understand why I'm getting hit on. And we talked a lot about how they kind of cooled out these guys. So it's, you know, for like probably most of the women in the room, it's like you have a lifetime of like learning how to like deal with unwanted attention and being hit on and being approached. But I think what's interesting for these guys is like, this is a new thing for them. Like that they struggle to know how to like, you know, they'd say like, I don't want to be really mean, like I don't want to just be like outright rejecting, and it's like I don't want to appear homophobic. So they had to do this like really carefully. Like they talked about like ways they would kind of like signal, like they'd say like start talking about a girlfriend or like interest in a woman, or sometimes be explicit, but again, they couldn't appear like homophobic and like in a panic about it. And like I should say that most of these guys said like, you know, like I have gay friends, like they support gay rights. They were like really interested in presenting themselves as non-homophobic. But I certainly think it raises complications.
Can we thank Professor Beaver?
Thank you all.